real-time-ish revolutionary war stories, which we're doing tonight. And if you love this one, there's one left in the series. It is Revolutionary War Ghost Stories down at Foster's and Rhinebeck. But there are a lot of other quality programs that are happening, courtesy of Historic Red Hook, with support from the County of Dutchess. Yes, it's Historic Red Hook. Feel free to clap. We love that enthusiasm. So there's a whole smorgasbord of those, including, for the locals, you know what's coming up next Saturday. It's Hard Scrabble Day out at the Village of Red Hook. And the historic kitchen in the Elmendorf Inn will be running from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So come by, watch how they make food in the 18th century. Be very grateful for microwaves and restaurants and all of the other conveniences. I always make a point to embarrass at least one of my many friends in the audience, and tonight that is going to be my dear colleague of 12 years, Kathleen Leonard, who has just tried to sneak in over here. Wave, Kathleen. So a lot of the research, you know you've made it as a historian when you have a research assistant. And a lot of the research for tonight's presentation was performed by Kathleen, who dug through hundreds of pages of published primary sources, published them in the 1840s, so that's almost as bad as reading period handwriting, not quite. But it takes a whole team here at Dutchess History, including those we borrow from other historical societies, like your executive director, Elizabeth Tatum from Historic Red Hook. If everything goes right with the technology tonight, that's her. If anything goes wrong, it's probably because I stepped on something or pulled a wire. So as you can see, and if those of you, maybe some of you have been following along, you've heard me make all kinds of promises about what tonight's program is going to be. And I can assure you that I will deliver on practically none of those promises. The only one that really has stayed true throughout the development of this program is that we are talking about the invasion of Canada in 1775. Thankfully, that does not fall under current events. But there are some takeaways here with geography. However, we are going to be looking at this through a very specific lens. So, let's first of all take a look at what we're not going to talk about. This is a map of the invasion of Canada. You will note that there are two routes. One that goes up through the Lake Champlain corridor, another that cuts its way tortuously through Maine and Quebec, in areas where there still really aren't roads today up the Kennebec River. What do we know militarily about this? Well, New York troops move out from Crown Point. You can still visit it today in upstate New York on Lake Champlain. In August of 1775, they make their way up what is known as the Great Warpath. This is an indigenous highway before Europeans arrive, and in the fine tradition of European armies everywhere, if you find indigenous people who are doing warfare more effectively than you are, you just copy them. You take all of their tricks of the trade and incorporate them. The British are defeated at St. John's on November 3rd, and don't worry, we'll get into more details on this. So that's way up here on the Richelieu River. It's the British strong point defending Montreal. November 13th, Montreal falls, and then American invasion forces join up in Quebec City in December of 1775. So while the rest of the 13 colonies are debating, well, I don't know, should we leave the British Empire, which seems like a physical impossibility? Should we renegotiate our position in the British Empire? Should we just forget April 19, 1775 in Massachusetts happened? New York's answer is, yeah, let's just go ahead and invade Canada and avoid any of these other problems. There are a tremendous number of great books on the military portion of this campaign. So you see there, Elliot Cohen's Conquered into Liberty, the Battle for the 14th Colony, and just think how easy it would be to get Poutine today if the Americans had succeeded in 1775 and 76. I'm sure the Canadians are very happy we didn't. And then Mike Gabriel put together a beautiful set of transcribed primary sources that talk about what was it like to live in Quebec City during this time. He is also the primary authority on General Montgomery. We are bringing him to Dutchess County in June of 2026 for RevCon on June 13th. So take your phones out now, mark that. You do not want any other event to conflict. So with all of this great stuff that's already been published, what could we possibly have to talk about tonight? Well, first and foremost, we're here because Lasting Joy is a wonderful place to be. We appreciate the staff. We appreciate the drinks. We appreciate the fact that they have food available now. You know, all of this stuff is great. The second thing is, there is a much broader context to the 1775 invasion of Canada. Because perhaps some of you have wondered, all the other colonies are debating these constitutional issues, and New York sidesteps it with a brutal military invasion of a neighboring colony. How did that occur to them? Turns out this is part of the colonial playbook way back. And of course, a lot of these military histories talk about the guns and drums approach. They will do things that I won't do tonight, you know. Dates, places, regimental identities, number of artillery shells fired, all that kind of good stuff. There's a greater drama to all of this, and especially to those of you who are admin managers, that drama is all about personnel issues. And those are the real woes of General Montgomery, because my God, this army is a lot of problems here, which I look forward to getting into with you tonight. So, we're beginning with our woes of General Montgomery now, but not quite there yet. You can see again 2 strikes to try to get to Quebec. So this is what we're going to cover tonight. Invading Canada, the precedents. Why is invading Canada seen as a logical thing to do in 1775? Instead of thinking out of the box. Our dramatis personae, because there are a whole bunch of names involved here that you probably haven't heard of before. And there's some names involved here that some people have tried to do a little PR cleaning up of their image in recent years, and we need to undo that tonight. That is one of my stated missions in Rev250. And then finally, we are going to go through those documents that Kathleen lovingly dredged up. I'm so glad that she has the same sort of penchant for self-harm that I do in terms of reading all of these documents. And this is, you know, for those of you who don't know, this story has a sad ending. Richard Montgomery does not make it home, at least not alive, from Quebec City. So there will be a lot of dark comedy along the way, but the final chapter is reeled down. All right, so Quebec, it is a popular place. It is the default capital of French Canada, even though Montreal is technically the capital of French Canada a lot of the time. And it is a spot where the English have, you know, had their eyes on for quite some time, because basically since the 17th century, the French are based out of the St. Lawrence River Valley. The English are in New England, mostly parts of New York. They keep trying to push westward. The indigenous people don't like this, but the French also don't like this, because the French have a fur trade going on that is extremely lucrative, because all of the hats in Europe at this point in time, the best ones, are made out of beaver skins. And of course, you don't get beavers in Europe. And it's kind of strange today in our hatless society to think about that, but everyone had to have a hat in the late 17th, throughout the 18th century, really up until post-World War II era. So if you had the market quarter on the stuff that you make hats with, that's pretty valuable. Not as valuable as sugar, but pretty close. So, when do we start with this invasions of Canada? We turn the clock almost all the way back to 1690, back when colonial wars were named after the reigning British monarch at the time. So 1690, you have King William, that is of William and Mary fame. He's busy fighting the French over in Europe, doesn't really care anything about what's happening in his American colonies, if he's even really aware of his American colonies. But Massachusetts, which has a long-running problem with French Canada, decides, you know, this seems like an opportune time to go try to take over French Canada. So you have Governor William Phipps, and his order is go up to Acadia, what we today know as Nova Scotia, and do something about the Acadians up there, because they are French who've been there long enough that they really are Canadian. They're involved with the indigenous peoples. They're raiding a lot of the Massachusetts northern settlements, because at this point in time, Maine is part of Massachusetts. So, Sir William Phipps sails up in 1690 with this expedition of Massachusetts Secondly, there's a lot of trees here. And we don't want to go inside that forest. We know what's happening. We've seen Last of the Mohicans. And then third, we can't actually see anyone, and there don't appear to be any French warships around, so why don't we go up to the mouth of the St. Lawrence, sail down, and see if we can burn Quebec City. So they lay siege to Quebec City from the river in October of 1690, and then the weather rolls in on them and they decide, you know what's probably a good idea is to go back to Boston before our ships are locked in the ice on the St. Lawrence River. So that is how the 1690 attack on Quebec in Canada ends. They actually lose a couple of ships in the river, which are great archaeological sites. 1745, this is King George's War. In Europe, it is the War of the Austrian Succession, but Massachusetts, which is always up for invading Canada, says again, this is an awesome opportunity, let's go invade Canada, except this time, the French built a fort on the tip of Nova Scotia called Fortress Louisbourg. And if you look down here, you'll see that big red dot there. The thing about Fortress Louisbourg is it's got a cannon that can reach out and make a meaningful impact on the English fleet. It also provides a sheltered harborage for French ships. So if you decide to just sail around it, to just go around and go down to St. Lawrence, you could find yourself blockaded up here by French squadrons. So New England decides the sensible thing is to lay siege to Louisbourg, which they do, and they capture it, which means that Louisbourg is doing its thing because it takes so long to take Louisbourg that once again the weather has closed in. The British ships cannot sail up, technically, actually, the St. Lawrence to get to Quebec City, so Louisbourg has sacrificed itself to save the rest of French Canada. The New Englanders, they stick around over the winter, terrible experience. And then, of course, they get word in early 1746, oh, peace has been made in Europe, and you have to give Louisbourg back. They are not happy with that. So that's expedition number 2 against French Canada. And you'll notice a pattern here of you sail up from New England, you go around by water, and you attack Quebec City. By water, it's just easier in the 18th century than trying to go through all of this wilderness. So tries like 3 through 7. This is the French and Indian War. It starts when George Washington shoots a French officer and then signs a piece of paper that he can't read because it's in French, which says, among other provisions, I agree to take responsibility for murdering a French officer. And that's how the 7 Years' War globally begins. So the British Army and their provincial forces have the idea we should invade Canada. But you know what? The French have a really big fleet here now, so maybe we should try going up the Great Warpath. And so they begin by building a fort, first of all, at Fort Edward, which is just down from Lake George. They build Fort William Henry, which you can see a 1950s roadside attraction version of today. What they're trying to do is get over Lake George, up Lake Champlain, onto the Richelieu River, and then drop down on Montreal. By 1760, they finally succeed. But in 56, they managed to establish a base on the bottom of Lake George, where the attractions are today. In 1757, the French burn it down. Super sad. 1758, they build a new camp there, and then they go up to lay siege to Fort Ticonderoga, and they have a vision of what World War I will look like, so they have these human wave assaults, which destroys the British Army and does nothing to affect the French. They finally take it in 1759, but they're so exhausted they can't go up the lake. And then finally, in 1760, they go up and go down to take Montreal, because in 1759, Quebec City falls to a different British invasion force that used the water routes. Down, up, I don't know what directions mean, the St. Lawrence River. So, for those of you who want to read along at home, that is the third and ultimately the successful invasion of Canada by Anglo-colonial forces. Canada becomes part of the British Empire at the treaty that ends the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars. We know it here because it took 9 years to fight it in America. And the French are basically like, do we like hats or do we like rum? Because they either have to give up Canada or they have to give up the Caribbean. And they decide, I think a wise decision, we'll keep the Caribbean. You guys can have Canada. Which, of course, then becomes one of the issues that the Americans use to justify rebellion against Great Britain. So any questions so far about all that? The real takeaway is invading Canada is reflexive in American DNA by the 1760s. All right, now, prelude to invasion. I know all of you have taken notes. You've followed closely along through all of our programming this year where we've talked about how the revolution started in April 19, what happened in New York, but just in case there are a few of you who haven't been with us, we're going to go through that briefly now. So, battles of Lexington and Concord, April 19, 1775. New York hears about it on April the 21st. The news spreads fast. As soon as that happens, a group of enterprising young border ruffians decide, you know what would be fun? How about, because we don't have British troops near us, we go up to Fort Ticonderoga and take it over. May 10, 1775, Fort Ticonderoga really falls to Ethan Allen and the so-called Green Mountain Boys, the Vermont militia. But Benedict Arnold is there too, and he really wants everyone to think it's his idea. More on that later. May 12th, they go up Lake Champlain or down, depending on your orientation, and take Crown Point. So they have basically mopped up all of the British troops in North America. Good for them. June 1775, the last little detachment of British redcoats who are in New York City are permitted by the now rebel American authorities to get on ships and sail up to Boston, where British General Gage has decided all of the redcoats must be for a while. And then some things happen in Boston that really don't concern us. But from June through August, there is no royal authority within New York. So the committees of safety get busy, they purge the militia of loyalists, they start raising regiments for Continental Army service, also for service inside we're moving towards state of New York. We're not there quite yet, but we're so close. And they make this decision, you know what would be fun? Invading Canada. Oh yeah. August of 75, we're getting so close to a 250th moment here. So, June 27, 1775, every colony gets one major general and two brigadier generals for the Continental Army. And New York's like, all right, we've got two people to choose from. We've got Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery. They were both veterans of the French and Indian War. Who should we choose? Who should we choose? We're going to go with Philip Schuyler for Major General and Richard Montgomery for Brigadier General. So Philip Schuyler, your first order of business is to figure out if we should invade Canada. Is this a practicable idea? So he investigates. He's like, you know, I'm feeling it. I've got a thought about this. Then in August, news arrives, oh wait, we thought all of the redcoats were in Boston, but we forgot about places like Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Chambly, Montreal, and Quebec City. There aren't a whole lot of redcoats there, and they really aren't like the A team or the B team. They're kind of like the W team, the Z team of the British Army, which they will show shortly. But they're doing the best job that they can to dig in to stop any American troops coming up this great warpath. They're also building a ship. And this is a big problem because you don't have air supremacy in the 18th century. You have naval supremacy. And there are really no ships on Lake Champlain at this point that can mount cannon. But the Brits are building one up at Saint-Jean. So the threat index is going higher and higher, and of course, the British authorities are also talking with their indigenous allies and being like, hey, we know that you really don't like the Americans, and for years, we have given you trade gifts, we've spoken to you about the need not to kill them. Turns out we were wrong about that, so you should just go down to Western New York and communicate with these people in whatever might happen to be a meaningful way for you. With violence, it's not a problem. And then, of course, the icing on top, on August the 23rd, 1775, and I can't believe I missed the social media opportunity to post on this, King George III releases the Proclamation of Rebellion, stating that which the proclamation lists, are now in open rebellion against the king, which makes them a war zone. It's kind of like anything goes at this point. All right, so now it's dramatis personae time. This is when you need to start getting your notebooks out, take out those phones, start figuring out who we're talking about, because there's going to be a lot of names here and maybe some completely unintentional humor. So first we have, well, the portrait wasn't the humorous part, but I kind of giggled at that when I saw it too. We have Philip Schuyler. I want to emphasize he is 41 years old in 1775. This is going to be important because I'm 44 and I have questions about some of his life decisions. So he is an Albany native. He's a French and Indian War veteran, but as Richard Montgomery points out, he's not a French and Indian War combat veteran. He was a quartermaster general. He knows about logistics. He knows about getting food to where the troops are. But in terms of actually commanding operational tactical level stuff, not so great. But technically he did serve during the war in an important position. But he is insanely politically connected. As you can see, he's Alexander Hamilton's future father-in-law. If you remember nothing else, remember that. So he's elected to Congress, and he serves there just long enough to be made New York's major general in the Continental Army. After that, he's released from duties, but poor health at age 41 ends up seeing him surrender field command to Montgomery. We can say that's poor health. There's a great quote that I'll read when we get to that. We can also say that Kent is probably not a place that anyone ever wants to spend the winter. So when it starts to get cold, you start to think about excuses to go back to New York. All right. He is still in command of the Northern Department when General John Burgoyne comes to visit in 1777, but he doesn't stay in command for too long. So that's Philip Schuyler. We're going to see him pop up a lot in terms of the woes and relating these woes, because he does a lot of the letter writing from his headquarters at Fort Ticonderoga. Very secure, very warm, behind, like tens of miles away from any sort of fight. Next on our list, the guy whose reputation some of us seem to want to rehabilitate, to say, well, before he tried to surrender West Point to the British and became the worst traitor in American history, he did some good. Another thing you should take away from tonight's presentation, Benedict Arnold never did any good. He was terrible. Anything that you might attribute to him being a good thing, it was an accident on his part, completely unintentional. The icing on the cake is the only monument to him is the Boots Monument, which does not have his name written on it, and which was paid for by Tivoli's own General John Watts Tyster, also a certifiably terrible human being. So, there you go. Benedict Arnold, he served for 13 days in the Connecticut militia during the French and Indian War. And after that, he purportedly served again, but deserted, although throughout his lifetime, he denied the veracity of that story, along with probably a lot of other stories about him. So he's a Connecticut boy. He ends up becoming an apothecary, and he begins his Revolutionary War service with a commission from Massachusetts. The real story behind all of this is that he really wants to be a soldier. He's got a commission in the Massachusetts, well, actually in the Connecticut militia, which has him with a red coat with buff facings. He looks like a real officer, because up until about 1776, real officers wear red coats regardless of which side they're on. And he first says to the militia in Connecticut, you know what would be great? How about we go take Fort Ticonderoga? They've got a lot of stuff we need. And another guy that we're soon going to meet, Governor Jonathan Trumbull says, that would be a terrible idea. We're not going to do that because we're very close to Boston. And there's a lot of British in Boston, and we need to be focused there. So Warren's like, all right, I'm going to go up to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And they're like, if we give you an officer's commission, will you go away? He's like, yes. So they're like, sold, piece of paper, go do something with yourself. Benedict Arnold wanders out to an area that is contested at the time. We call it Vermont today. but it was claimed on one side by New York and on the other side by New Hampshire. And he figures, I'm going to find some rowdies out there who will follow me. Spoiler alert, no one will ever willingly follow Benedict Arnold. And we'll go take Fort Ticonderoga, and then I can become a general. Well, it doesn't necessarily work out that way, because after Ty falls, and he's like, hey, New York, well, you know, it would be great if you made me your major general, even though I'm not from around anywhere in New York. Like, no, we're going to pick Philip. We're going to pick Philip Schuyler, our local warrior. Good. And of course, he complains to George Washington, because he and Washington are like this, which I believe is another piece of evidence that George Washington had terrible personal judgment, right up until the point where Arnold betrayed him. But we'll again get to that later on. So our next one, Ethan Allen, you'll notice that this looks shockingly like a Civil War era daguerreotype. That is because it is a Civil War era daguerreotype. This is Ethan Allen's grandson, General Ethan Allen Hitchcock. There is no from-life image of Ethan Allen, but his daughter, this guy's mom, swore in a newspaper article that this guy's the spitting image of Ethan Allen. So that is what historians have for a couple of generations now used as, you know, just like put a Rev4 frock coat on him, some long hair, the surly expression, that's probably straight up correct there. So Ethan Allen, he does serve briefly during the French and Indian War in the Connecticut militia. You'll see Connecticut pop up a lot. It is a source of a great deal of trouble for the British Empire. Unlike Arnold, he serves more than 13 days. His unit is mobilized to go relieve Fort William Henry in 1757. But before they get there, they hear that, oh wait, the French have massacred the garrison and burned the fort to the ground, so they do the smart thing and go home. Then he eventually gets kind of run out of Connecticut by a combination of questionable personal habits, I'm thinking hygiene here, and zero acumen at business. So he's like, you know what would be a good thing is we could go up to the Hampshire grounds and set up shop, except that, you know, New York and New Hampshire are arguing over whose land this is. And that's important because if you have a deed to land from the government of New Hampshire colony and New York takes over, then your deed is worthless. On the other hand, if you have a deed from the governor of New York and New Hampshire takes over, it's worthless too. Ethan Allen, being an enterprising fellow, says, hi, all right. All of us actually live here where there is technically no government except for the one that we've set up for ourselves. How about we set up our own militia, and then if anyone comes to tell us that we can't have our own land, we deal with them in an 18th century way. And all of his neighbors are like, all right, cool, that sounds good to us. They end up being called the Green Mountain Boys. I don't really think technically during the period. This is a name that comes up later. But when it comes time, when the news arrives, hey, you know what? The Brits have started the war, and now it's open season on redcoats. They're like, oh, Fort Ticonderoga is like right over there. How about we go take it? And just as they are beginning to get into their boats to row down or up, depending on your perspective, Lake Champlain, to attack Fort Ty, Benedict Arnold shows up, and he says, I have a commission from the government of Massachusetts, which has nothing to do with where you live. But I have a red coat, so I should be in command. And all the guys look at him, and they look at Ethan Allen, and then they proceed to just go do what they were going to do anyway. But he tags along and makes a nuisance of himself the entire time. And of course, Ethan Allen wins, as we will see, the award for the Northern Department's rowdiest CO. Unfortunately, it costs him a hard 3 years of his life. David Worcester. His major distinction is, if you wondered how to pronounce the town that looks like it's spelled Worcester, that's how you do it. It's Worcester in Massachusetts, born England. You can see up there by his birth date, he is one of the older gentlemen involved in this conflict. And it shows in his military background. He served in practically every military engagement in the colonies, at least in terms of the wars, since George I. And George I came to the throne in 1714. He has extensive command experience from the French and Indian War, and in my book, his greatest claim to competence he survived both attacks on Fort Ticonderoga, which makes him part of a very select crew. So when 1775 comes around, he is the Brigadier General for Connecticut. And he will end up, because the expedition up to Canada under Montgomery has New England troops as well as New York troops in it, he'll end up being sort of a de facto right-hand man for Montgomery. He's the military governor of Montreal after it's taken over. And after the end of General Montgomery's woes, David Worcester ends up taking command of the Northern Army. Jonathan Trumbull does not leave Connecticut during the American Revolution, but he's a Harvard alum, he's a Connecticut militia officer, he was a provincial commander during the French and Indian War, was effectively governor of Connecticut from 1766 to 1784. He is the only governor to start as a royal governor and end as a state governor. And most importantly of all, he has lots of famous children, including John Trumbull, who painted this portrait of him. But he receives a lot of letters because Connecticut is basically the manpower source for the Continental Army's efforts outside of the Boston area in 1775, because all the Massachusetts guys are going to the siege of Boston, so they're not really there. Then we get Henry Beekman Livingston, the bad boy of Livingston Manor. We are technically on Livingston Manor right now. I guess there's one in every house. So he is the son of Judge Robert R. Livingston, not to be confused with the 16 other Robert R. Livingstons. That is not a joke, even though it is really funny. And his mom is Margaret Beekman Livingston. He is the brother-in-law to Richard Montgomery, which seems to do him absolutely no good during this campaign. So much for family ties. He's commissioned as a captain in the 4th New York Regiment of the Continental Line, the last one to be organized in 1775. And he's erased from basically all of the Livingston family trees for reasons that I will probably make vague allusions to, but I want you to come back in 2026, so we won't hear the whole story of that. But he's got some great comedically serious stuff at the beginning. And then we have the real hero of tonight's presentation, Governor Guy Carleton. Now that's Governor Guy Carleton. He is your British officer. He's lots of fun at parties, unlike Governor Trumbull. So he's a British Army veteran. He serves in the 1759 invasion of Canada. You might see a pattern, but some of these guys not only have previous military service, they are also personally experienced in attacking Canada and Quebec. They have done this before, albeit under a different flag. And in his case, he gets to experience the French side of the invasion that he was involved in 1759, because in 1775, the British Army basically repurposes all of the forts that the French built to keep the British out, and now try to keep the Americans out. So he's governor of Quebec from 1768 to 1778. That seems like strangely convenient. It's because after General John Burgoyne's experience in New York in 1777, Guy Carleton writes back to London and says, you know what, I would really like to be relieved because that guy was a jerk and I told him not to do what he did. And now we lost like 8,000 guys. Unacceptable. He's knighted in 1776 for his defense of Canada, which tells you a lot about how this story is going to end. He rises to be the last British commander-in-chief in New York City in 1782 to 83. He oversees the evacuation. He is probably the smartest general officer in the British Army in North America between 1770 and 1790. So smart, in fact, that they bring him back to serve as governor of Canada after the American Revolution. But because he's so smart, he never gets a field command, because that's how power works. And then last but not least, our reason for the season, General Richard Montgomery, relatively young guy when all of this unfolds. He's born in Ireland. He is a career British Army officer through the French and Indian War. So remember how I the siege of Louisburg in 1758. In 1759, he makes a return trip down to Quebec City. He's part of the force that takes it from the St. Lawrence. So, you know, why not? So he has a lot of experience with all this. Actually, I'm going to take that back. In 1759, he was part of the group that went up through Fort Ticonderoga and ended up in Montreal in 1760. So he is retracing his footsteps in 1775. But after the war, he decides, I'm done with being an officer. It's way too stressful. And I met this lady in Rhinebeck and Hudson Valley. And I think I'm going to retire and become sort of a country surveyor gentleman. So he comes back and he marries Janet Livingston, who is also a child of Judge Robert R. Livingston and there's too many Beekman Livingstons here, Margaret Beekman Livingston. And Janet is, of course, the old spinster at like 32. So the judge is very happy about this, gives them a cottage in what is today the village of Rhinebeck, and the Chancellor Livingston chapter of the DAR still owns and runs that cottage as a museum today. So if you want to check it out during one of their open times, you now have a story of, unfortunately, the less happy part of Richard Montgomery's life to connect with it. So he's commissioned as the Brigadier General for New York, despite the fact that he spent a lot of time writing Congress to tell them that he was actually more experienced than Philip Schuyler because he was a combat veteran as opposed to a quartermaster general. But he's passed over. Nevertheless, command will eventually devolve onto him. So now it's time to begin the woes of Richard Montgomery. Those woes begin with Henry Beekman Livingston, because all woes begin in some way with Henry Beekman Livingston. So, August 8th, 1775, and I am going to awkwardly read some of this because I love the language of the 18th century. And any of you who are either military veterans or like management veterans will appreciate this. Henry Beekman Livingston writes to one of his cousins, also a Livingston, who is the head of the New York Provincial Congress. And he says, Sir, I have enlisted upwards of 72 men, some of whom have since deserted, and others have refused to appear. I now lack 12 men of the number prescribed me. I have kept those I have upon duty constantly from the time of their enlistment, and have them tolerably well disciplined. We are much in want of clothes, arms, shoes, etc. We are unfit for a march until we have these necessaries, and some of my men who have families here would be very unwilling to march until part of their pay is advanced to them. Several of them have been long upon duty, and their families want. I should be exceedingly obliged to you if you would make a proper presentation of this matter to the Congress, that's the New York Provincial Congress, and get our wants supplied. I am as yet ignorant of the name of my colonel or the regiment to which I belong. This makes it difficult for me to know who to apply to for the aforementioned necessaries. One of the men is very unwell and at present incapable of duty. Another has contracted the venereal disorder since I have enlisted. Yeah, you know how this goes, guys. I should be exceedingly glad to have directions how to proceed with these men or any other who may after be taken ill. And at the end he notes, I have not yet seen my second lieutenant, but expect him today with 20 men, so that when he comes, I shall have more than my complement. So, he's recruited 72 guys, because you have to recruit a certain number of soldiers in order to be a captain. That's how this works in the American Army of 1775. Some of them have deserted. This is a problem. The ones he has, they have not been issued uniforms. They haven't been issued shoes. They haven't been issued all the other stuff that soldiers are supposed to have, because this is not the militia. This is the common line, which means you show up and they give you everything, except they don't, because it's the common line. And then really for me, doesn't know which regiment his company belongs to, classic HR issue there, but cannot locate his second lieutenant. I feel like this is a timeless element of military service. Second lieutenants just disappear. Wow. All right, so that's the first problem, is you you are raising this army for immediate service. You can't get them enough stuff. You can't get the soldiers moving away from where they have enlisted. And basically, if you want soldiers to stay with an army, you have to take them away from their homes as quickly as possible, because otherwise they will go home. And then, of course, having your second lieutenant not there, not knowing who your colonel is, just like, what kind of army is this? Well, it gets worse. So, Montgomery is up in Albany. He is gathering all of these troops because, again, Henry Beekman Livingston is part of the 4th New York. That means they have raised 3 other New York regiments. All of those guys have arms, they have equipment, they have clothing. You know what they don't have is gunpowder. That's kind of a necessary supply if you want to fight. So if you have guns and you can't shoot them, that's philosophical. So he robs the Tryon County militia of their powder. For those who don't know, Tryon County is everything west of Albany in 1775. They're not sure how far it goes, but it's going to be Tryon County. And he tells the provincial Congress, look, do not send me any more troops without powder. Would anyone like to guess if this happens? No. Exactly. Every reinforcement he gets, no powder. And this becomes a big issue as they move into Canada. So, G-Dubs is involved in this story. He's not under the dramatis personae because, honestly, if you don't know George Washington, I'd like to know how, because it blows my mind. So G-Dubs is, of course, over in Cambridge. He's besieging Boston. He's focused on how can I get like a classic set-piece battle with British General Howe, because then I can prove that they should have made me the British officer that I always wanted to be back in the 1760s. And then, of course, Ethan Allen waltzes in, not Ethan Allen, my apologies, Benedict Arnold waltzes into his headquarters and says, can you believe it? Not only will New York not make me their ultimate military commander, as if, but they won't even let me go on their expedition to Canada. G-Dubs is like, well, this is alarming because I like you for inexplicable reasons. I guess my weak character overall just makes me attracted to criminals. But surely there must be something we can do. Do you have any ideas about something you'd like to do? Well, I think I should still be able to invade Canada, because then maybe New York will love me. Well, you can't go up the Champlain corridor because General Schuyler is going that way. Like, well, how about this? I look on a map. I see there's a river that runs from northern Massachusetts, what we today know as Maine, all the way up to the St. Lawrence. I bet it's navigable. I bet it's not a howling wilderness. And I'm sure we can get up there faster than anyone else can. And the only reason that no one has done this before is that I'm the smartest person ever. Yeah, because you know the map is the terrain, right? So G-Dubs is like, well, ordinarily, rational thought would lead me to believe that this is all insane. But you speak with such authority, it must be true. Have 800 men go find your fate and your fortune up in Canada. So, off goes Arnold through the literal howling wilderness. There's no one up there. Even the indigenous people are like, do not want to live here. So, he cuts his way up, but he lets Schuyler know this is happening, and is like, hey, just thinking out loud here. If you don't want to go to Canada, don't worry about it. My guy's got it covered. I'm sure it's going to be fine. But if you do go to Canada, don't be mad at me for authorizing this expedition. I just had a feeling about it. This could be a diversion for your invasion, because you know that somehow in an age before drones and radios, the British are going to think like, wait, someone's coming up the Kennebec River. We should definitely be more worried about that than the people coming up the Champlain corridor. Yeah. But the real icing on this letter is that G-Dubs is a little worried because, man, if we have 2 invasion forces, the Canadians might become annoyed with us. And we want them to be our friends, even though they have stalwart bluntly refused to join us in open rebellion against the crown. All right, and that is your master strategy for 1775. So, Schuyler is actually still with the Canadian Army at this time. He writes to Governor Trump from Ticonderoga on August 31st, and he says, all right, General Montgomery has left Crown Point with a couple of thousand guys, 1,200, and I will follow him in good time. It's August, the weather's great, the bugs aren't too bad, but meanwhile, the New York Provincial Congress, and again, the invasion of Canada has now started. So you would expect everything to be like figured out and tied down back in Albany, right? Except they're all New Yorkers. You know that that's never the case. First of all, Henry Beekman Livingston is still trying to figure out who his colonel is. That's the 4th Regiment. Those are the relief that's supposed to come up. And also, the New York Provincial Congress is busy writing Montgomery a letter about how we're going to send you more guys with no power. And maybe not even muskets, but you keep saying you want more men, so here they come. So your first article is St. John's, Austin, St. John's. So, Glens Falls is down here at the base of Lake Lake George. You've got Ticonderoga up here at the portage between Lake George and Lake Champlain. You go all the way up to Lake George. It's very super easy sailing until you get to Richelieu River and Ile-en-Loire, which is the first choke point. So in either direction, if you set up a fortification at Ile-en-Loire, you can block river traffic. So that's good. The British have decided to fortify what is today Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, and they have a dependent fortification slightly south called Chambly. Now there is no river that goes directly from New York and Lake George up to Montreal. You have to go up to Sorel and then drop down or alternatively up the river to get to Montreal. So their first goal is to get to Saint-Jean and overrun. And they're thinking like, all right, Fort Ty, super easy. Crown Point, even easier. Saint-Jean's got to be a easy thing, right? And Schuyler is still with the army at this time. That's how you know that things are going well, the weather's nice, everything is super cool. So, they look at the British defenses and they're like, wait a second. Remember all that stuff that we heard back in June about the British Army preparing their defenses and other things like that? Turns out that was actually true. And St. John is not a place that we can attack right now because we don't have enough cannon. Cannon's very heavy, tends to follow the rest of the army up. Even worse, they figure out, that sloop of war that we were afraid that they were going to build, it turns out they built it and they were within days of launching it. So we need to get back down to Ile-en-Loire, fortify it, because if that sloop gets into Lake Champlain, it's going to shoot up all of our transport vessels, because we have no gunboats, we have no sloop of our own to use against it. That would be a huge problem. So the Americans return from up here, Saint-Jean, down to Ile-en-Loire, and they fortify. And this is the point at which Schuyler decides it's time to go back to Fort Ty. He writes a letter to the Congress, and he says, you know, cough, cough, hack, hack, I feel the rheumatism coming on, I've got the fever, my nose is a little runny, my hair is itchy, which means snow is, I just can't be here anymore. So he goes all the way back down to Fort Ty. He does note that Ethan Allen has arrived with his contingent of troops on September 14th. Something might be happening to Ethan Allen soon. And then the plan is, all right, we're going to set up at Ile-en-Loire in case the British launch that sloop. We're going to keep them from getting it down to Lake Champlain. But we're going to do a regular siege of Saint-Jean. And that means digging trenches and parallel trenches, and like weeks and weeks and weeks of not a whole lot of fun. So, September the 27th, our next big dot here, because the Americans begin investing Saint-Jean, that means digging their trenches on September 17th. A mere 10 days later, Ethan Allen is captured by the British. So what has Ethan Allen done? Well, he's like, you know what worked against Fort Ty? I had like 35 guys, and I got in a boat. I rode down the lake, and I just rolled in there. It was like, what's up? Everyone's asleep. Fort's mine now. I bet that'll work in Montreal, too. Not so much, because Guy Carleton is up in Montreal, and he believes in a thing called patrolling. So Ethan Allen and his 30 men and 50 Canadians are in their canoes. They get spotted by redcoats. They get shot up, a couple of guys are wounded or captured, and Ethan Allen is captured. And this leads Montgomery to write this memorable line of having to lament. I'm going to read this for you because I love it. I have to lament Mr. Allen's imprudence and ambition, which urged him to this affair single-handed, when he might have had a considerable reinforcement. So, this is a tip of the hat to the fact that in addition to not having sort of sustainable military organization, in addition to not giving guys the supplies they need, in addition to sending an army to Canada without gunpowder, the officers aren't obeying the chain of command. And when the officers don't obey the chain of command, nobody obeys the chain of command. And this is going to become an increasing problem as this army moves through to take these posts in Canada. Now we have our comic interlude. And part of the comedy is me making sure that I have the right section in front of me. So Samuel Mock, he's one of the Connecticut officers. He writes to Governor Trumbull on October 6th. And the first thing he says is, we've been in front of St. John's since September 17th, and it is terrible up here because it has been raining the whole time. And all of the land around this fort is a swamp. And if you've ever dug ditches in a swamp before, that's not a lot of fun. He then goes on to say, I'm really super sad that General Montgomery left. I had a very good understanding with him and a good agreement in all modes of prosecuting the expedition. But to my sorrow and embarrassment of the service, there is not that good understanding that I could wish now. And why is that? What is wrong with Montgomery that Samuel Mott does not like? And this is where the gold is. General Montgomery has chosen as his confidant one Colonel Campbell, a Scotchman who has been an officer in the regulars and is now Deputy Quartermaster General and is very profane. I should be very sorry to inform your honor that there is scarcely a word heard from headquarters without some oaths and curses on every occasion. But I value myself on the righteousness of the cause and hope in God for success. I have no great opinion of Montgomery's generalship, although I believe him to be a man of courage. That is but a small, though essential, qualification of a general. And then he goes on to lash out at the New York common line, saying that despite the fact that the New Yorkers are in charge, all I see when I look around the siege are Connecticut troops, because the New York regiments haven't shown up yet. So now our presentation begins to go downhill into darkness. So, the ultimate paternalism of G-dubs. And this is related, if I've got this correctly, yes, to Ethan Allen. So Ethan Allen is captured on September 27th, and Carleton knows who he is. And Carleton decides, I really don't like how you took away Fort Ty, Crown Point, and made things really embarrassing for us. So he puts him on bread and water, he puts him on close confinement. This is not the sort of lifestyle that an officer who is a prisoner expects to experience. In the 18th century, you're supposed to be granted parole, which means you're on your honor not to do anything bad, but otherwise you can just waltz around, you can go to the tavern, you can eat out, you have your freedom. Not so much for Ethan Allen. However, remember, Ethan Allen has no prior military experience. He is the rowdiest commanding officer in the Northern Army. And this is what G-dubs has. So first, he's concerned for Arnold. No one knows where Arnold is. And at this point, George Washington is saying to Schuyler, you might have to to go find him and rescue him. We really have no idea what happened. He's really concerned for Ethan Allen, but Colonel Allen's misfortune will, I hope, teach a lesson of prudence and subordination to others who may be too ambitious to outshine their general officers, and regardless of order and duty, rush into enterprises which have unfavorable effects to the public and are destructive to themselves. So, no sympathy for Ethan Allen. All right, so it is now October. We're moving into November. What's the weather like in Canada in November? Not good. So, Skylar again, writing from the relative comfort of Fort Ticonderoga, notes that, oh, I got a letter from Montgomery on November 6th from St. John's. St. John's fell to the Americans on November the 3rd. Montgomery is writing, hey, Montreal's next. We're just going to go up the Richelieu River and fall back down again. But he notes that at Ticonderoga, the snow has already started falling. And the troops there don't have winter clothing, which means if they don't have winter clothing, the guys who are even further north around Montreal definitely don't have winter clothing. On the other hand, of course, there's no sign of no one's heard anything about. Where is he? Maybe Mars. But more importantly, says Schuyler, I have a fantastic plan that I've written on paper for how 3,000 men are going to occupy Canada throughout this winter into the next. So they're really counting on absolute victory here. And then November 13th, you get a letter from Montgomery, who's up in Montreal. The city has fallen to him. A couple of bad things happen. First of all, the weather is terrible, really bad. Second thing, a lot of the very small British garrison that was left in Montreal got caught. Because if you remember that map a little while ago, you actually you go up the Richelieu River to Sorel and then come down. Well, before Governor Carleton can evacuate Montreal, the Americans make it up to Sorel and set up a bunch of artillery positions. So as the Brits are trying to sail up or down the St. Lawrence to get to Quebec City, they encounter this artillery and are like, well, crap, I guess we might as well surrender. Except for Carleton, who gets into a canoe with a couple of guys and just literally paddles their way past the American defenses and makes it safely to Quebec City. By the time the Americans reach Montreal, more bad news. The British had dumped their entire powder supply into the St. Lawrence River. All that gunpowder, you thought you were going to get captured? Not so much now. But they've heard that Arnold has arrived at Quebec City, really across from at Point Levis. And even better, that whole officers not listening to general officers not listening to each other thing is really beginning to become super problematic. And Montgomery's pretty upset about it because several of the officers, the senior ones, the colonels, have come to him and said, we want all the clothing that is here in Montreal for the British soldiers because our guys are cold and we need it. They're so cold, we don't care if they wear red uniforms. And Montgomery, being a British officer, says to them, the clothing is actually the personal property of these soldiers. You can't take it away from it. That's not how we fight a war. They threaten to mutiny, and he says, well, you know what? I guess then I'll just go home. And he writes in his letter to Schuyler that he will go home even if he has to walk down the side of the lake this winter. He's just tired of it. He wants to be back in Rhinebeck. I don't blame him for that. I would have chosen Red Hook, obviously, but it's all Red Hook. Second offer of resignation comes on November 24th. And this is again related to officers not obeying orders. It's getting really cold now. There's snow, there's ice, soldiers are beginning to desert because they don't really want to be in a Canadian winter, they aren't being paid. So first, officers are leaving, American officers who are on duty in St. John's, just begin to be like, you know what I can do, because it's the 18th century, even if this was a real army, I could do this, but it's a fake army, it's the Continental Army. I'm just going to go home. And what are they going to do to me? Absolutely nothing. So officers are leaving there. Other senior officers, they didn't learn from Montgomery's response when they tried to steal the clothing of the Redcoats. They come back and say, hey, we've got another second grievance. You let the British officers out on parole, whereas Ethan Allen is on a prison ship in Quebec City. It's like, not okay to do this. Montgomery's like, fine, you know what's up? That's an insult. So I'm resigning. You guys can figure this mess out for yourselves. So the colonels look at each other like, man, this is a bad idea. None of us want to be in charge. It's easier to complain than it is to find a solution. So they go back to Montgomery and say, we didn't mean it that way. We're sorry. Will you take command again? And he says, yeah, I guess maybe for a little while longer. Quebec City, around December 2nd, Montgomery's forces, or at least parts of them, begin heading over to Quebec to link up with Benedict Arnold. But it's only 800 guys. It is not a huge military force. And as he writes on December 18th, he's been besieging Quebec for 2 weeks. Not like a huge amount of time here. The British garrison, though, has been firing their cannons at the Americans continuously, so maybe they're running out of ammunition. And he fears that if he does not take the city soon, reinforcements might arrive because the river has not frozen over. And there are all of these reports that, hey, a British naval force might be en route and there's no way to block it because Louisbourg is actually under British control at this point in time. So we need to get on with this situation, much as I'm almost done with this presentation. If it weren't for that, he would wait until April to try to take over the city of Quebec. Now, his last official letter on December the 26th, 1775. First, he reports he wanted to storm the city, but elements of Benedict Arnold's command flat out refused. These are private soldiers saying, we're not going to do it. That's a huge problem. What makes it even worse, and the craziest thing about this is in the original surviving document, he had written names and then erased them. The junior officers, the captains and the lieutenants, are encouraging their men not to follow orders. That's basically the end of an army, at least by European standards at the time. There is no money to be had to pay the soldiers. All of the specie they had to pay to the Canadians because the Canadians are like, we have food, we have blankets, you want these things? The Americans are like, yeah, like good, pay us in gold or silver because we don't care about your paper money. But they are out of cash. So, this is his last line in his last letter. That gets it. I take it for granted measures are taken to supply my place. Should not anybody arrive shortly for that purpose, I must conclude Congress mean to leave the management of affairs to General Worcester's hands. And therefore, if this business should terminate in a blockade, I shall think myself at liberty to return. However, if possible, I shall first make an effort for the reduction of the town. 5 days later, on December the 31st, 1775, as all of the American enlistments are giving out, there's an attempt to storm the lower town of Quebec City, and these spots are marked there today if you go visit. General Montgomery leads a force in from the west. Arnold leads a force in from the east and trying to get over one of these barricades.